Welcome to another screencast, and this time we'll be discussing epithelial tissue 1. There's a second epithelial tissue 1 as well. We'll be talking about the individual types of epithelia, but this time we want to identify and describe characteristics and functions of the epithelium. Talk briefly about the intercellular connections. Look at the apical surface and the basement membrane, which is also sometimes referred to as the lamina propria. And then by the end of this, you should be able to describe and explain here similarities and differences between endocrine glands and exocrine glands, as well as explaining physiological functions that are enhanced by microvilli and or the cilia. So epithelial tissue here is one of the four main tissue types, the others being connective tissue, muscle tissue, and neural tissue or nervous tissue. And epithelial tissues, as per this prefix implies here, epi is upon. Right? And so epithelial tissue is going to cover, line cavities, protect, and also be responsible for secreting. So if we look at our chimpanzee here, we see that he has a nasal cavity, right, oral cavity that's open up to this digestive tract here. That digestive tract then continues all the way until the end, and that is essentially open to the outside world. Right? So this is a tube, and so the epithelial tissue is going to line that cavity. There are also the airways. Right? So the airways are also lined by epithelial tissue. Your urinary bladder and reproductive tracts are lined with epithelial tissue as well. And the body cavities, so the thoracic cavity, that abdominal pelvic cavity, the cranial cavity, where your spinal cord is, all those cavities are also lined with epithelia. And what they're showing you here are just the different sort of subcategories of that, and we'll address those in another screencast. So the covering, the lining of the cavities, and the protective nature of the epithelium these are characteristics or examples of epithelium. So epithelium is going to form, first and foremost here, the body's surface. And so we have these membranes, right? And so the cutaneous membrane is also referred to sometimes just as the skin or the integument. And that is obviously protective, right, from the outside. And so you have this cutaneous membrane that is going to protect you from abrasions, going to protect you from chemicals, going to protect you from biological agents. So that is bacteria, viruses, pardon me. So this outermost protective coating here is sort of obvious. Not as obvious maybe are the protective and the lining features here. You have other membranes that are made of epithelium, and these mucous membranes secrete mucus, which is sort of thick and stringy at times. And so the mucous membranes will be lining cavities that are open to the outside world. Open to the outside. And pardon me, and they will, these cavities are open to the outside, obviously the nasal cavity, the airway, but then what's not as obvious to some people is that sort of this mouth and then the esophagus and the digestive cavity, you are actually open to the world at two ends there, the mouth end and then the anus end, and that things that are inside of the stomach are actually still not in the body because they've not crossed this mucous membrane. And so the lining of those cavities by mucous membranes, the mucous membranes again are open to the outside world. So not only respiratory and digestive, but reproductive and urinary as well, are mucous membranes. Epithelium forms membranes that line the cavities, and we had mentioned about the thoracic cavity and the abdominopelvic cavity. And these membranes are serous membranes, and they will be secreting not mucus, but they secrete a serous fluid, which is a little more watery compared. It has a much higher water content compared with mucus. And these serous membranes are not open to the outside world. Right? And so these serous membranes are closed cavities. So this might be a good place to pause and summarize up to this point. So the epithelium here, this is it forms the body surface, skin, right, et cetera, but also will line the ducts that are open, that will line cavities open to the outside world, as well as the serous membranes. And so this is a section through part of the intestine, just to give you an example of what's happening here. So the small intestine, right, food would be traveling sort of in this pathway. Actually, should sort of dash this because it's inside there. So the food would be following that pathway, right? And that pathway is open to the outside world. That's just the lumen there. And so the membrane that will be lining this lumen, which is open to the outside world, is formed by epithelium. And since it's open to the outside world, it will be a mucous membrane, and so it's sometimes referred to as the mucosa. That mucosa has an epithelial content to it, right, but also has a muscular component and has a connective tissue component to it as well. So there's an epithelium, a connective tissue, and a muscle layer. So technically, this is an organ because it has more than one tissue type present. Right? But I'm highlighting just the epithelial part there. If you look on the outside of the organ, there is a serous membrane because it is going to be secreting a watery substance, and that is covering the outside of the organ and allows the organ to move past itself inside the abdomen. And again, it itself is going to be an epithelium, so here's the epithelial component to it, but then it also has a connective tissue component to it as well. So that makes again the whole intestine there an organ. One more thing we want to point out here is that in this submucosa below the mucosal layer, you also have glands, and glands are also epithelial in nature. They're derived from epithelial tissue, and the glands will secrete substances. Right? In this case, the gland, so here we see another gland right here, this gland is going to secrete directly into the lumen there, right, via this little duct. And so this would be a duct here. So we know because it says ducts, and ducts from the glands right there. And it's secreting something, in this case probably digestive enzymes, right into the lumen of that small intestine. So again, just showing you a cross-section there through the intestine. One last thing we want to point out is that in this organ there is also nervous tissue or neural tissue, and that neural tissue, once it gets into the organ, it branches, right, and will have contact with the epithelium. Right? So the epithelium also serves as a sensory mechanism. So there are specialized cells in the epithelium that will be detecting differences in the internal environment and conveying that to the central nervous system. Hold on. So the epithelial tissue has 5 special characteristics, right? So number 1 is that the cells of the epithelium, since they're covering and lining, the cells are closely bound together. The cells are closely bound together to form a sheet. Second thing is that there is a free surface to the epithelium, and we refer to that as the apical surface. And a third characteristic is that they are anchored, the cells are anchored to a basement membrane, which is made of connective tissue, CT connective tissue, not cellular. A fourth characteristic is that they are avascular. that there is no direct blood supply to them. And because there's no direct blood supply, they have to rely on diffusion of their nutrients and waste products. And lastly, they display continuous regeneration. Continuous regeneration. That is, that they are stem cell-like and that they are constantly proliferating via the mitotic cell cycle. So you're constantly dividing, growing, dividing cells here. This makes sense because if they are in contact with the outside world in some way, they're being abraded. If you lose cells, you need a way to regenerate them pretty quickly. Avascular, no direct blood supply. Right? You have to rely on diffusion across a relatively far distance for oxygen and nutrients and for CO2 loss and other waste products to be removed. Back up here, something about this anchoring to the basement membrane. That basement membrane is also sometimes referred to, again, as the lamina propria. And again, it is just connective tissue. It's not on the free side of it. Again, that free side of the apical side is typically folded in some way into cilia or microvilli. And these folds of the cell membrane greatly increase the surface area for absorption across or secretion out of. And lastly, again, these cells that are anchored closely together, bound together by structures, proteins in the membrane called desmosomes. You also have proteins that form tight junctions. And you have gap junctions as well. So all of these 5 characteristics are, or most of these five characteristics here you should be able to find them here on this diagram over here. So as a way to review, you want to sort of match up the words with that diagram on the other side there. Right? Might be a good idea to pause here. Talk quickly here about the difference between the glandular part of the epithelium, pardon me, and the difference between endocrine glands and exocrine glands. Right? Exocrine glands, right, as we showed you in that cross-section of the small intestine, secrete into a duct, right, here that is open to the outside world. Examples of exocrine glands would be sweat glands, milk glands in the mammary areas, and then digestive enzymes as well. So these are the things that get secreted out of a duct. And so you see here in this cartoon that the cells that line this duct, this would be the epithelial cell, and we're calling that a duct cell here. And then these are the secretory cells down here. So glandular epithelium is doing secreting. And what the secreting is depends on the type of gland cell that it is. So here, mammary gland is going to be secreting milk. Sebaceous glands, this secretes sebum, right, or oil. And then, of course, sweat glands are secreting sweat. Right? Fun little fact here is that actually milk is modified sweat. Right? That is really pleasant, I'm sure. So exocrine glands secrete into a duct that's open to an outside world, whereas endocrine glands, those cells, for instance, in the thyroid gland here, these ones, endocrine cells, will secrete into the bloodstream. Now, the bloodstream is not open to the outside world, so it's not exo, it's endo, within. Right? And so here we have the bloodstream. This is the bloodstream here. And these are the secretory cells here that are going to be secreting their secretion directly into the bloodstream. And so endocrine glands secrete their stuff into there. So again, thyroid hormones, T3, T4. These hormones play a role in metabolism, metabolic rates. Also, we see the pancreas. The pancreas is interesting because it has both endocrine and exocrine functions. Right? So there's exocrine tissue in the pancreas, and there's endocrine tissue as well. The endocrine tissue is the one that secretes the insulin and glucagon, and the exocrine secretes digestive enzymes there. Right? More on that in more detail later, but endocrine, exocrine glands there. Okay. Finally, review here 4 essential functions of epithelium. One is that they have a way to control permeability. So things are going to need to go across that epithelium there. If it doesn't go across, right, then it stays on the outside. So some of those epithelia are impermeable, and some are permeable. So the cells control what goes across them or through them. The second one, and probably should have started with this one, it's a little more obvious, right, is some sort of physical protection for the cells that are underneath that, right? From, again, being abraded, from abrasion, from dehydration, drying out, and then from chemical and biological agents that might serve to damage them. So chemicals like acids, bases, those sorts of things. We mentioned that there is neural tissue there, so they play a role in a function in sensation. Right? So there are specialized sensory cells that will detect changes in the environment, either outside or the inside environment. So what's going on inside the body, or also what's going on outside the body. Right? And lastly, the glandular part there is specialized secretions. And again, that difference between endocrine secretions and exocrine secretions there, and using an example, so exocrine and endocrine. And so these are all the various functions of epithelial tissue. So again, there we go. Going back, looking, pausing as you need to, being able to identify and describe here. There are 5 characteristics of epithelium. There are 4 sort of general main functions there. Talk about the different types of intercellular connections. There were 3 of those. A little bit about this apical surface and the microvilli and the cilia, as well as that basement membrane. Being able to compare and contrast here endocrine and exocrine glands. How are they similar? How are they different? And then a little bit about the cilia and the microvilli. I'm not sure I touched on that, but we can read about it, ask about it in class. Okay, thanks. See you later.